John wrote this, John chapter 1, verse 4, and then down in verse number 14. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. Here it is. And we have seen His glory. The glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. God became human so we could see His grace and we could see His truth. We could see Him doing everything that He tells us He wants us to do. He modeled it for us. But let's talk just a minute about the first section of those verses that I just read. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. You know what that whole idea of the Word is? In ancient Israel, they had such a high regard for God and for the use of His name, because one of those 10 commandments was, don't misuse the name of the Lord your God. They didn't want to even take a chance of misusing His name. And they carried that to such an extreme that they didn't even want to say His name. And so for generations, they never pronounced His name. And that created a little problem. Because you see, in the Hebrew language, when you write the Hebrew language, you only write the consonants. You don't write the vowels. And so, as they went along, they knew the pronunciation of those consonants because by hearing those words spoken generation after generation, they knew where the vowels went in, but they didn't write the vowels. Well, if you don't say a word for 2 or 3 generations, guess what happens? Nobody knows what vowels went in there anymore. Are you aware of that? Are you aware that that's why the Old Testament name for God, the most often used name for God in the Old Testament, some people say Jehovah, some people say Yahweh, some people say Yeshua. 3 or 4 different ways to pronounce that same Hebrew word in the Old Testament. You know why there's different ways to pronounce it? All of them could be correct depending on where you put the vowels. They didn't know how to pronounce it anymore because when they were reading along in those Old Testament scriptures, unrolled the scroll in the synagogues and began to read those scriptures, and they came to the name of God because they didn't want to take a chance of misusing it, they would come to His name and they would just say, the Word. Oh, there's that word that represents the name of God. And so they'd be reading along and they would just say, there it is, the Word. They wouldn't pronounce it. After 3 or 4 generations, nobody knew how to pronounce it. And John was writing his gospel peculiarly to get the Jesus story into the minds of Jewish people. So he put it in their vernacular. He said, in the beginning was, well, he wouldn't write Jehovah or say Jehovah, Yeshua. He wouldn't say it. He said, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word, this God of the Old Testament, became flesh, and we could see Him living out His own rules before our very eyes. Isn't that incredible?